So, this is Panzer Dragoon Remake. I want to preface this video by saying I don't have any real nostalgia for this franchise. I didn't have a Sega friend growing up, most of the people I knew were either Nintendo or Sony, and by the time we had hit high school, Sega was squarely out of the console market and porting their titles to other consoles or just developing for other consoles. I also expect a lot of people picking this up don't have any nostalgia for it either, because only about 8 people outside of Japan bought the Saturn. And while I'm happy you're getting this, it's not something I picked up out of love, it was more curiosity. The original game came out about 25 years ago. Dear God, Panzer Dragoon came out 25 years ago. And its major gimmick was more in its visuals and rendering of 3D space than its gameplay. So I wanted to see what Remake was going to do to build off something that's pretty novel by today's standards. I'm also a sucker for stylized visuals, and Panzer Dragoon Remake definitely does not disappoint on style. I have played the original though. One of the first things I did upon moving to Japan was buy a Saturn, since large chunks of the games for it are pretty cheap over here, Panzer Dragoon included. It's a bare-bones rail shooter. I imagine a good chunk of people that are going to buy Remake on Switch are probably thinking of something closer to Star Fox from the trailer, but this is not that. Even the original game was not that. It's not a snappy space shooter. It's more like a visual experience with some arcade shooter elements sprinkled on top. You fly, you shoot, and you can charge your homing shot. The real catch is that by hitting the shoulder buttons, you can rotate the camera into one of 4 different viewing planes, which will change the ways that you can move around and what you can shoot at. So the whole gimmick is you watch your radar at the top, see where enemies are spawning, rotate the camera, and then shoot them, and just continue to do that while you are propelled through the level naturally. This looked pretty cool 2.5 decades ago when something like a fully rendered 3D level wasn't really common, but Remake doesn't do much other than directly port this idea with some graphical enhancements. So in that sense, I guess they got the focus of the original game right when rebuilding it. In the case of movement, though, your only real defense is to try and shoot down enemy fire. You don't have like a dodge or a barrel roll, and movement is so limited that dodging doesn't always feel possible. Your dragon's kind of stuck in place, and while there are some spaces where you can move up and down a little bit, you're not going to be able to just kind of go out of the way of things. So you really kind of have to push into your head that while you can move the camera around you, you can't really move around the camera. It's kind of hard to describe without actually experiencing it. Like, I think even the video doesn't really show kind of the mental combat you have to do with yourself to realize that you have to direct the camera in order to stay out of danger, and you can't just kind of focus on what's in front of you. Also, it's kind of hard to describe the shooting as anything other than clunky. The default controls have shoot on the face button, which is fine. You actually have to mash a lot to intercept enemy fire, and it's much easier to mash with your thumb than, say, like your index finger. But the reticle to aim isn't tied directly to your movement, so if you move the dragon, it'll move a little, but really you want to move it independently. But the problem is the reticle is tied to the D-pad, and your movement is tied to the left analog stick. You do have the option to swap to something called a modern setting, which moves the reticle to the right analog stick, but then that also moves the fire button to your triggers. And the triggers on the Switch and the Switch Pro controller really aren't made for mashing. I wish the modern setting gave you 2 different buttons, one that you could hold to just rapid fire shots, and the other that you could use for the charge shot instead of just giving you 2 shoot buttons. Or better yet, I wish you could just remap the buttons naturally, but that isn't an option. There's also a real lack of feedback. Enemies will clearly indicate when you're shooting at them and hurting them because they'll flash white, but what you can and can't shoot isn't always 100% clear. So for example, the boss of the 3rd episode has a few areas that are lit up, so naturally you think, okay, I'm gonna shoot there. But if you don't precisely time your shots, even if it looks like they're hitting that spot, it won't count, even though that's exactly where you're supposed to hit. Also, while you're doing this, the boss has these wing-like appendages that kind of spin around it, and since you can't really move to dodge them, or at least not all of them, you might think, oh, well, you can shoot them off, but they don't blink, there's no real feedback for shooting them, so it's probably best to not waste your time doing that, and it just kind of makes the whole thing a frustrating ordeal, because here's this attack you can't dodge, you can't really heal up, there's no recovery, so you just kind of have to tank everything and hope you do more damage to the boss and kill it before it kills you. So those are my initial thoughts on Panzer Dragoon Remake. It's a very pretty game. It's got a very lovely soundtrack, and those were kind of the highlights of it on the Saturn, and I think they did a really good job of keeping those things very unique and interesting here. And I can tell a lot of love went into recreating this game and its gameplay, but that gameplay feels like it's stuck in 1995. It's stuck in that era of early 3D experimentation when we collectively left that all behind decades ago.